what value does childhood have in primitive Africa? Welcome to African folklore, culture, and history. This week, I begin an episode on the value of childhood in primitive Africa. When an outsider sees the African child, he or she sees an infantile beast who needs to till the rough ground. The African child is no less than the puppet waiting to be controlled. This treatment becomes unfair to the African child because the world is never seen through the eyes of an African child who has hope, dreams, aspirations, and above all, the idea of a life worth living. Many agree that if you never lived as a child in Africa, then you could never understand what the child saw when he or she sat with the elders. You could never grasp the world he created with his or her imagination and the possibilities that hold the dreams together. In most African villages, towns, childhood is accepted as a cultural phase in the life of every person. It is cultural because the town and village makers expect every child to fulfill certain communal requirements. I take the first requirement now, the requirement of informal education. Every child is introduced to the ancestral wisdom of his or her forefather. He or she knows every war fought and every warrior and their ceremonial chants that led them straight into war as mighty men riding on high horses. The child knows the past mistakes, lives in the present, and approaches the future with caution. The requirement of spiritual awareness. Every child is introduced to the levels of African God system. He or she understands the small levels of gods in relation to different elements of life, such as fire, earth, water, air, etc. The African child understands the idea of the primal God. The primal God who creates all these elements and all the small gods that you can think about or imagine. The African child understands the rituals, the atonements, the practices, and the rites. The requirement of family bond. Every African child knows the family history and the myth that made the family special, which had been made into interesting, didactic stories. He knows the spirit which either protects or troubles the family, and he knows the sickness whose chain must be broken and the choices to be made. How much he knows, how much the African child knows, cannot be captured in its entirety in today's episode. I will complete this episode next week. I remain your tale teller, Abiola. See you next week.